And now we want to offer you a video of a very famous researcher, Lynne McTaggart from Britain. And we do a lot of research with her. So she's really fantastic what she's doing. And she specially recorded for us her presentation. And please watch it and enjoy it, because it's very, very interesting.
Hello, everybody. I am thrilled to be taking part in Dr. Konstantin Korotkov's annual conference. And I'm thrilled if there are new people here and also who have seen me before. So I want to tell you about some experiments I've done with Dr. Korotkov that are really mind-boggling in their implications, and also some other work that I've been doing with group intention. So to do that, I'm going to share my screen and show you some of the results, the extraordinary results we've had. One moment, please. I'll just share this now. Okay. So I started back in 2007 wanting to test the power of intention. You know, we'd heard lots of things about manifestation and The Secret and all kinds of things like that. But because I'm a journalist by trade and by background, I was very skeptical of the whole thing. And I wanted to see how far we can take this to work. But in 2007, when I published a book by the same name called The Intention Experiment, I also invited my readers from around the world to take part in a series of experiments that I would do with various labs around the world to test whether our thoughts are actually things that can affect other things. So we worked with the University of Arizona, Penn State University, University of California, University of Freiburg in Germany, and also with Dr. Korotkov in Russia. And as I say, I didn't think it was going to work. Well, to date, I've run about 38 experiments, and 34 have shown measurable, positive, mostly significant effects. There is no pharmaceutical drug out there with that kind of consistent track record. So we started out small. We did water experiments. I worked with Dr. Korotkov on an experiment in Lake Biwa in Japan to try to purify a sample of the water, make it move to a higher pH. I've done peace intention experiments and experiments to lower violence in violent areas, including the most violent place in America. And we've even tried to heal someone of post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I say, of those 38 experiments, 34 have shown measurable, positive, mostly significant effects. Now, in the past year, I've done a series of extraordinary experiments with Dr. Korotkov that have, as I say, some amazing implications. So I wanted to share with you how this started. So as I say, Dr. Korotkov and I have done lots of experiments, particularly on water. 2017, we decided to do an experiment using his new device called Sputnik. You know, we'd done a lot of work with his GDV equipment, and he'd measured, you know, individuals after intention, but he invented this wonderful little device named after one of the early Russian spacecraft, as you probably know, and called it an integral environment analyzer. And here's what it does. It measures human emotions on the environment. And because human emotions make very tiny changes in the atmospheric charge, the ability of the atmosphere to store charge, Sputnik can pick that up. It's extremely sensitive to any kind of changes in electromagnetic fields. And we know that emotions affect our parasympathetic nervous changes in all sorts of things, from perspiration in blood to electrical conductivity of the body, et cetera, et cetera. And this change appears and is picked up in the environment by way of our exhalation or any emissions we make through our endocrine system. But here's the interesting thing: when we change emotionally, so does Sputnik. And the higher our emotional charge, the higher the changes in Sputnik. So Dr. Korotkov suggested we do one. First of all, using this equipment in groups of people, my Power of 8 groups, where I've taken small groups of people and put them together. And we've measured stress levels in individuals, as we did in 2014 in a little conference that I was speaking at. And when we pulled, we could pick up changes in their stress levels. As you can see, almost everybody's stress levels went down. They're little bars in red after our intention. We also found big changes in chakra alignments. And this is again with this GDV equipment. Before, you can see chakra alignments all over the place, particularly in the group on the left. And then afterward, we also measured the ambient field. And we found big changes after our intention. So what happened was in 2017, we decided to do a water experiment. And we decided to do something different. To date, what I had done was have either people assembled in an audience when I was speaking somewhere, or my followers around the world on the internet, something in a laboratory or at a place. Well, this time we decided to do an intention, but by a great distance. So we decided to do a water experiment, but what we would do was Dr. Korotkov would set up his equipment in his Russian laboratory, and I would ask my audience sitting there in Miami to send intention to the water in that setup. So we did that, sent an intention, and we had very specific timings that Dr. Korotkov did not know about until afterward. He just turned on his equipment several hours before and kept it going afterward. And I only revealed the timings after he had finished doing his calculations. So he had finished having his equipment turned on, and then looked at how they related to Sputnik's effect. So in a sense, we were thinking of something in Miami, but sending it to St. Petersburg in Russia. So here's what happened. That little red bar, as you can see, denotes a huge change just at the time we were doing our intention. So we started thinking about that. And last June, a year ago, a little over a year ago, we decided to do something really interesting. We thought, well, what if our target is something else, but we direct the audience's attention to Sputnik in St. Petersburg? So we decided to do an intention experiment on June 15th of a year ago to try to heal America, specifically the area where there had been the police killing of George Floyd and all of the riots that erupted around the country afterward. So we decided to have an intention to lower violence, but also to focus on Sputnik. So there was our intention, to lower violence and restore peace during all of those racial protests. So we had a very specific intention, as we usually do, but we sent people's attention and their focus to Sputnik. So we did that, and afterward, we found a big change. So as you can see, there is a change in the various measurements that Dr. Korotkov makes in terms of area and entropy just at the point of our intention. So that was interesting. We decided to follow that on. So we did another right after, it was in September, after the terrible explosion in Beirut. So we decided to do an intention to rebuild the Middle East and specifically Beirut. So we had an intention for people to receive more money and donations that they need to rebuild their city. And interestingly enough, we found after this experiment that there were several large donations that went toward Beirut, essentially in the week after our intention. So that was interesting. But once again, we had them focus on Sputnik. And again, Sputnik recorded this big change. As you can see, a big lifting right at the point of our intention. Once again, we didn't give Dr. Korotkov the information about the timings until afterward. So then we decided the riots in the Capitol in Washington in January, on January 6th, we thought perhaps we ought to do an intention to lower violence in Washington, D.C. Right before the inauguration on January 20th. So we did the same kind of intention where we focused on Washington to be immediately free of all violent protest and have peace during the inauguration. So we had people focus on an image of where the inauguration was going to take place, but also, once again, focus on Sputnik. And afterward, like all the others, we had a change, an interesting change just at the point of our intention. And a change, as you can see, going down like that and then coming up again to where it was before. So then our final one was just a month ago, May 21st, when we decided to do an intention, a double intention. At first, we had planned to do a healing polarization intention experiment because we were doing it right around the time of the anniversary of the death of George Floyd. There had been more division after the policeman who killed Floyd was convicted just around this time. So we wanted to try to heal things between African Americans and the police. So that was the initial plan. But then we also, and this was going to be our intention, so we carried on this intention to heal the divisions and racial prejudice between African Americans and the police, but we also focused on Sputnik. And during the same session, and this was broadcast by around the world, as were all of the other intentions that we did. We either broadcast via Facebook or live streamed or some other form of live streaming through to audiences of thousands. So in every single case, people were sitting individually in front of their computer screens. So we did this intention, but then we decided, because just about the time we were going to film this and carry out this experiment, the whole Israel and Palestine crisis erupted again, and there was all of the fighting. So we decided to send an intention for a ceasefire. Before we could do that, the very day of our experiment, a ceasefire was called, and so our intention became maintaining the ceasefire. So we had the two, and once again, we asked people to intend for the current ceasefire to result focused on Sputnik. So here's the really interesting result. So as you can see, there's a big change and a very coherent change during the two experiments shown by the brackets. And afterward, that's what it looks like afterward. It went back to its kind of random course. So, as Dr. Korotkov said when he wrote to me about the results, the sensor signal dropped down significantly. And during the second experiment, the signal continued to drop, but less significantly, but carried on falling until the end of the experiment, which was 7:14 p.m. UK time, as you can see in figure 2. And another measure of this was entropy values, which again dropped down during the first experiment and increased after we finished. So in other words, there was greater randomness after. So as Dr. Korotkov concluded, from the presented data, we can conclude that during that first experiment, Sputnik's signal changed significantly, which may be correlated with the intention action. And during the second experiment, we see a change of its signal, but it may be a natural process related to the first experiment. In other words, the big emotional change, the big sense of coherence occurred when we first started and just carried on. So this was all really interesting, but here it gets even more interesting because as I have done since 2008, with every experiment, I survey the participants to ask them if anything changed in their life, how they felt during the experiment, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the one. These are the results of our most recent one, the experiment on May 21st. And you'll see these mirror what we have done to date that has had to do with peace, lowering peace or healing someone. So for instance, we would ask people, did you experience any physical sensations? And over half felt that they were part of a higher network. A third of people, a quarter of people said they were crying or sobbing or experiencing intense visualizations, or their bodies were tingling and felt warm. And more than a quarter had an overwhelming sense of energy. And let me remind you once again, these were people sitting at home in front of their own computer screen, just participating individually. Nevertheless, they felt this overwhelming energy, feeling part of a higher network. People wrote things like this. They felt chills, were moved to tears. Someone else felt lots of energy and activity through my whole strong electrical current-like feeling, especially in my brain. During the log-on moment, seeing people from all over the world saying hello to each other in the live chat, and just being in the company of all these global peacekeepers, I felt I'd met up with my family and I cried. Other people, someone said, heart shed tears of overwhelm. And somebody else said, I saw the whole earth shining like a sun and all the people connected in light and peace and love. After it ended, said someone, I did the sending again with the replay because it felt so good. And I experienced the same heart-centered emotions, just with the recording. Tears the whole time. I felt I was part of something larger than myself. So people felt really connected and had physical feelings of connection, energy, crying, goosebumps, all of that. But people changes in their lives. Half of the people, and this happens every single time, felt more love for everyone they came into contact with. They were hugging strangers. They felt more love for loved ones. They were getting along with people not like them, people they normally argue with. Their own lives were becoming peaceful as a result of being part of this experiment. They found this kind of peace and improvement in their relationships occurred across the board. One person said, my partner's more caring and I feel more love for him. Somebody else with a bad relationship with their neighbors said their neighbors suddenly came to see them in a very friendly way. Somebody else said, my sister and I hardly talk, we're polar opposites. We've been talking every day since May 21st. Somebody else, her husband is opening up and they've been getting things sorted out, talking with someone else, finally letting go of needing to control and keep helping my children. I feel happy, light, ready for a huge change. Another person becoming closer to her husband and participating. Amazing. But people also found incredible changes in themselves and their attitude toward the world, more loving toward the world in general, 41% more loving toward themselves, more in love with their lives, more tolerant of people not like them, more than a quarter of people forgiving things about themselves, and 41% wanting to work for peace or heal areas of high violence. People were experiencing profound changes with one participation. And I want to remind everybody, this is a 10-minute exercise. We had two, not even, they were about 8-minute intentions for the two areas, first America and then the Middle East. People wrote things like this. One person went for a job interview with a nonprofit in their neighborhood that works with homeless women. Somebody else said, it's easier for me to open my heart again and again during the day and just feel the good and beautiful in me, not so many negative thoughts anymore. I'm so thankful for this experience. Healing this area means a lot for me and to the world. This is a person who was in Israel in 1986. Less fearful of strangers on the street. I approached a homeless man who was crying. It didn't even occur to me to be afraid. This really brings hope like nothing else ever has, said someone. And once people's whole attitude toward the world and themselves was changing. But besides that, people reported amazing physical improvements. Somebody with asthma didn't use their asthma spray at all. And today, only once, they said, I feel calmer, more balanced. Someone else said, my shoulder has been hurting for weeks, and after the meditation, the pain went away and didn't return. Somebody else had hernia surgery right after the experiment. And their last words before going under were blessings to all of you. And to everyone's surprise, I have not had one bit of pain. Came out of the surgery without pain. Somebody else, more energy than usual. And this person with lung disease can breathe more easily. Someone else more flexible, feeling younger. Weight. Somebody else less chronic pain and stress burnout from work. And so many people wrote about being more peaceful, more calm, more grounded. So I want to remind you of where this was happening. I call it 1,000 points of light because people were participating from all over the world. I just put a few stars around where people were, but they were everywhere around the world. And I remind you, Sputnik was in Russia, in St. Petersburg. I was in London, in the UK, and everyone else was everywhere else. And yet we were having an effect on Sputnik, and we were having an effect on the participants. So what does that mean? What that means, essentially, is that we create an extraordinary psychic internet when we come together in group intention that target not only can be affected by highly sensitive equipment sitting thousands of miles away from us, but also we have effect on ourselves and each other just after one 10-minute intention. So as I've talked about before, and I've looked at it occurred to me early on in these experiments that there was some sort of mirror effect, that not only was the target being affected, but the participants themselves. And after I realized that, I started scaling this down to put people in small groups of 8 or so, to have them do intention to a member of the group with a health challenge. And I've run thousands of these around the world. But I wanted to tell you about my first year-long group of Power of 8 participants. That if this worked so well, and when I put people together in Power of 8 groups, it was really an experiment back in 2008 in a workshop in Chicago. And I expected it would just be a tiny feel-good effect, and that's not what happened at all. People had amazing changes. Someone with migraines, chronic migraines, said that her head felt clear and stayed clear. Somebody else with terrible irritable bowel syndrome said his gut felt normal. Somebody else who had terrible arthritis in the knee was walking normally that day. Someone else with cataracts said she was 80% better. So I kept doing this in workshops, and it finally occurred to me that I really needed to study what is going on. So I put people in Power of 8 groups on for an entire year, and I studied them, and I had them, and I monitored them to find out if everything in their life would begin to heal. And I had about 250 people in that first course back in 2015. And one of them was a guy called Mitchell Dean. Now, Mitchell suffered from chronic, serious depression, which wasn't a great look because he's a clinical psychologist. So we put him into groups, and I named all of the groups, as I do with all of my courses. We name them after something. This year's master class, year-long class, we've named people after Beatles songs. But back then, we named people after Greek gods. And he was part of a group called the Helios. So he met with them every week for the year. And not only his chronic depression to heal. And what happened was his group set him an intention to find the source of his depression. And sometimes it was suicidal depression. And here's what happened.
What happened right around the beginning of that time was realizing that a lot of this is related to how my liver processes toxins. And that had never been named in all the years I'd been working on this. And suddenly it became apparent that the second level of liver filtration apparently wasn't working very well. And we got a hold of that one, began to treat that with herbs and supplements, and it really helped. I think, though, there's something more synergistic than just an allopathic idea that this cured the depression. It was like at the same time, I found my Qigong practice was getting a much deeper. My meditations were deeper. I was finding I was much more able to myself. During that Helios time, my practice got much more interesting, and I began to integrate ways of working that I'd wanted to do for years that had never quite worked. And so all of those have their own sort of antidepressant effect, right? It was like everything got healthier. It doesn't go nearly as deep. It doesn't happen nearly as often. I can still have blue days, but they feel more like blue days instead of really, really heavy ones. And so it's made a huge difference. Yeah. In that same process, I lost a good 15 pounds. Yes. I mean, it was such an interesting time. My trainer at one point kept joking, I don't know what's going on with you, man. It's like you're aging backward. Like, this shouldn't be possible at 45 that your muscle mass is going up once a week. What exactly are you doing, man? I'm like, I don't know what's going on. It was fun. And so, yes, I started to write about the gray sequence, and I'm still working on that, but made a lot of progress during that time with Helios. And I don't know, it was really fun. There's something mysterious about it. And, you know, the psychologist in me was wondering that all year. It's like, what exactly is going on here? Surely some of it is that we stop and we're paying attention to ourselves in better ways. I'm sure a little bit of it is that Chinese idea that qi follows thought, right? So that could be some of it. I wasn't really thinking about a number of things that started to happen. I didn't go in with a goal of changing depression. I want to say it feels almost karmic in that work. So there we are doing deep intention work for somebody who's wanting to have a baby and having not even in our group, or working on somebody's cancer or MS. And there's something beautiful that I think happens in the natural flow of life, that as we send out, it naturally comes back. And we don't do a lot of sending out.
So that started me thinking about some of the reasons why this can be going on. But just to let you know about that year-long Power of Eight group, I started, as I said, I studied them, not only Mitchell Dean, but the whole group. And here's just a sampling of what happened. Allison Mavey repigmented her skin. She had vitiligo and it started repigmenting. Marianne was a very shy person who was living at the very north of Canada and was working a job in a laboratory. And through the group's intention, she got the courage to leave that soulless job, follow her real dream, which was to become a therapist. And there she is on a purple motorcycle. Then we had Jolie, who was desperate to start her own business, but her husband wanted her to stay home and maintain herself as a housewife. And so their intention was for him to accept her desire and her dreams. And suddenly he completely turned around and she has successfully started her own business. Then we have Bev, who was down to her last 200 pounds and had wanted to set up an organization and a website called Love Your Mark to help people accept birthmarks, as she has on her face. And after the group did intention for her, Lloyd's of from them, where she had worked in the past, saying that she could apply for a grant, and she did, and out of so many different candidates, she got it, and she got all the money she needed to set up this new organization. Then we got Mitchell, who, as you hear, not only healed, his depression, lost weight, was able to write, overcome his writer's block, and just about every other part of his life improved, including his practice. Melissa, who was in her 50s, got herself a dream job, which came out of nowhere. And Trudy, who regained her hearing. And Andy, who not only went through such a model divorce, thanks to the intention of her group, so that the lawyers on both sides wanted to know what her secret was, but also got an amazing dream job out of nowhere. And out of that 250, to meet regularly, pretty much 100% had major life transformations. So my big question, of course, is what's going on here? What on earth is behind all of this miraculous change in individuals, in small groups, in individuals, in the huge intention experiments? And I carried out, I was very lucky with Life University, the largest chiropractic university in the world. They offered to put their neuroscience department at my disposal so that we could study what was going on. And so run by Dr. Stephanie Sullivan, the chief neuroscientist. There we did an experiment using student volunteers, and we set up 7 Power of 8 groups, put an EEG cap on one member of each of the groups, and then studied them. And here's what Dr. Sullivan said.
So honestly, pretty amazing results. Now, qualifying that, and that this was a case series where we only had 6 individuals that we were looking at. But to be honest, it was amazing. Across the board, we had one participant that varied slightly, but everyone else actually had a decrease in their frontal lobe, their parietal lobe, and their temporal lobe, and with some additional decrease in their occipital lobe. And all of this was on the right side of their brain. And of course, my natural thought is that, okay, this is going to look like meditation. So I was honestly surprised when it didn't look like the traditional meditation studies that we've seen where there was an increase in alpha.
And that was surprising to both of us. Now, in meditation, when you look at this brainwave signature studies in meditation, you find that in the main, it causes an increase in certain alpha waves and theta waves, the slower brain waves that are associated with meditation and light dreaming. And also an increase in the parietal lobes. And what that is the me in relation to the world. They sit, I'll show you a brain picture in a moment, but they sit toward the back of the head on either side of the head. They help us determine what's me and what's not me. And they are actually increased with meditation. And so what that's doing is increasing parts of the self aspects of the brain. We may feel very oceanic, but we still have a sense of me. And so meditation slows or speeds these kinds of brain waves. You can see the slow brain waves on the bottom, the alpha, the theta, and the delta, or gamma rays. Gamma waves. It increases in certain cases of advanced meditation. Wave frequency in certain parts of the brain so that it's operating at a kind of peak intensity. But mainly people are slowing their brain waves down. But the main point here with meditation is you don't really leave the self. With group intention, the opposite occurs. You're turning off the self, essentially. With our intention study, we found a quieting of all brainwave bands, but also particularly a quieting of the frontal and parietal lobes. And so what we're doing is essentially there's a blurring between me and not me. And so we feel essentially this sense of oneness. So there's a picture of where the parietal lobes sit and the frontal lobes, but all of them are dialed down, but most particularly those areas. And the frontal lobes, the parts of the frontal lobes that are decreasing also are those parts involved with work. So these experiments didn't look like meditation at all. So we found decreases in the brain waves related to self and a decrease in the conversation, the talking between frontal lobes and parietal lobes. And also what seems to happen is the object of focus essentially takes over the self. So in this case, it's usually either focusing on an intention experiment target or focusing on some other member of the group. And what that part of the brain, the left parietal lobe, getting very much involved with self, is turned down. And the right parietal lobe moves away from self and focuses more on the object of intention. So as I say, we're basically dialing down the self. So our work looks nothing like meditation, but Newberg, who was at the University of Pennsylvania studying Buddhist monks during ecstatic prayer, Sufi masters during chanting, and he found essentially identical brainwave signatures to ours. Quieting of the parietal lobes, quieting of the frontal lobes, and a blurring between me and not me. So essentially what we're talking about is people who are involved in power of 8 groups or intention experiments have these extraordinary experiences because they enter an extraordinary state of oneness. The self is turned down and they have this what by all accounts is essentially all of the hallmarks of a mystical experience. Now, do remember something. With our experiment with Life University, our study of Power of 8 groups, meditators, most of them hadn't even meditated before. These were not people who knew anything about Power of 8 groups. They were just student volunteers, and they had a 15-minute video from me instructing them in the rudimentaries of how to do it. Nevertheless, they were transported into this mystical state. So essentially, there was no other conclusion I could draw. Participating in a group intention experience is a fast track to the miraculous. So this power of oneness has to be one of the big pieces here of why these are so powerful. And I've seen plenty of evidence about that. I mean, for instance, there's one interesting study of Oxford rowers, and it found that people's pain thresholds, a rower's pain threshold, is much higher when he's rowing in a group than when he's rowing alone. And we've seen that with so many other studies. Community is like essentially a healer of sorts. A community protects you against heart attacks, stroke, even the common cold. So there is something about the group experience, but also that sense of all growing together, all being in this together, that sense of oneness that is so powerful. And we get that in what people say about Power of 8 groups. Here's just a few of the comments people have talked about. I mean, one woman, after participating in her first Power of 8 group, said, there was this light, a ball of light, a light being of sorts, as if they were the magnifiers and they were behind us and their energy was coming through us. Somebody else said, who was the object of the intention, that she felt through the whole 10 minutes was holding my leg. Now, nobody was touching her leg. This was an intention for somebody who had terrible knee arthritis and was due to have an operation. And by the way, she did a deep squat after she did the intention, and she never had to have the surgery. Somebody else talked about Kundalini type energy pouring out onto the floor through my arm. Somebody else, and many people, talk about heightened senses. He said, the grass was intensely green. The flowers have never smelled so sweet. Somebody else, it charged my spiritual battery. People have said things like this, like Rosa, when she was in a Power of 8 group. I felt that I was giving and receiving healing, like I was healing myself. And Amy, when participating in an intention experiment, and this one was, I believe, to lower, I had the sense that although we had a specific target, we were healing everyone, everywhere at once. It is that extraordinary sense of oneness that happens with a group intention. It doesn't matter whether it's a group of thousands or just 8 in a circle. And it doesn't have to be in person. It can all be virtual. So this is the kind of thing people say.
In that group of 8 was opening directly to source, to each of our hearts, and this huge expanse of awareness of a universe, bigger than any of us. it's a sense of wellness and well-being that I can't say I've experienced before.
Attention in this group and in a group does something very powerful to the body and mind and all of us are meditators and do a lot of, we don't get that anyplace else, and we can't do that by ourselves.
I felt the energy running through our hands. I felt the vibrations in the room change. I felt a very sort of special atmosphere was being created. I don't know, high vibration, very pure, little piece of heaven, call it what you want. But there was something that seemed to me that there was something special in that room.
So we know that people enter into a state of oneness. They have a mystical experience. And again, the interesting thing about this is when we think about mystical experiences, we think that you need to suffer or spend years of practice. You need to go into a sweat lodge, or you need to, learn for years meditative techniques, or you need hours of priming to get into that state. Once again, these are people, the people that I just showed are people who were for the very first time. And they just had some instruction from me, and yet entered into that state of oneness. So there's oneness as part of it, but there's also the healing power of altruism. I have studied a lot of the science around altruism because I realized that intention experiment groups and the smaller Power of 8 groups are essentially an altruistic act. Most of the time, you are sending intention to someone else rather than receiving it yourself. And that's not something we do very much in the personal development field. It's usually all about me, me, me. So I've looked at the evidence, and people who do things for other people live longer, healthier lives. No question, happier lives too. People who are more likely to suffer or negativity do so because they're focused on the self. You look at studies of volunteers and you find their death rates are 2/3 lower. They are far healthier, they're far more physically active, they're half as likely to be depressed. And even if you help your neighbor take out their garbage, any kind of helping hand, when you're lending a helping hand, you find that people are much more likely to be happy. 42% are more likely to be happy just by doing that little simple act of altruism. Same thing when people are ill with mental health challenges. They find if they help other people, they will improve the most. And if you have an illness and you help someone else with the same condition, you're more likely to heal. So altruism is helpful for healing life, for living a longer life. And part of that has to do with the fact that when you do something for someone else, you experience what scientists call a helper's high. It's like the endorphins that are released when you do exercise. It's a feel-good moment, and that feel-good moment carries on into your life. So that's one piece of it. And we found that when Andy, who was trying to get a job and failing miserably through her group, she was part of that 2015 group. She was failing and nothing worked. So I finally said to her, Andy, get off of yourself. Intend for this young boy called Luke, who had tried to commit suicide. And here's what happened.
Being instructed as part of a class to focus on somebody else, I felt a lightness right there. And then Luke for a couple weeks. And I want to say very quickly, within that first 2 weeks, I ended up getting a completely unexpected job offer. I wasn't looking for that type of job. I never thought this person would offer me a job, and I didn't even really expect that I would get any job offers, because I hadn't really been putting myself out there in that 2 weeks. I've been doing some other stuff. So it was just totally out of the blue in every way you can humanly imagine. And it was right up my alley. I had a gift store for many years. I did product development for a lot of the manufacturers and the artists that I supported. And this was a job working for a prominent artist who needed help putting her art on products. So I was uniquely suited. I wasn't really thinking, like, I closed my store, I want to be a product development person, but I was excited for it. It was just like the perfect opportunity dropping in my lap.
And that happened over and over and over again. When people in my master classes, in my Power of 8 groups, would stop focusing on themselves, their lives in every regard started healing. Whether they needed physical healing, whether they needed a new career, whether they needed more money, whether they needed to improve their relationships, or even find a new life purpose. Everything started to change when they got off of themselves. And the final piece that I realized is there is power in these groups to entrain into a sense of connection. Now, when you see a famous study that was discovered by a Dutch scientist who discovered when clocks with pendulums that were swinging in different directions were next to each other, they would ultimately end up swinging in the same direction. And we know that brains work that way too, and bodies work that way. For instance, when guitarists are playing together, within the first few minutes of playing together, their brain waves start synchronizing. And we know from studies done by the Institute of Noetic Sciences, when someone sends intention to someone else, they did a big study of partners where one partner had cancer. They discovered that when the well partner would send intention to his ill partner, their heart rate would start synchronizing, their brain waves would start synchronizing, the rate of their blood flowing to their extremities would start synchronizing, their breathing would start synchronizing. Well, I believe that that's the same thing that happens with a group and group intention. We start becoming entrained. So we're a little bit like this. Imagine this is a Power of 8 group. These are metronomes. Start out being all swinging in different directions. And look what happens. Now, it took 16 seconds for those metronomes to start swinging in synchrony because of the exchanges of energy. We know that with the science. Well, I believe that's what happens with people too. So, you have to ask, year after year, I see this in my groups, when people meet regularly, and that's the key piece, when they commit to meeting regularly with their Power of 8 groups. And by the way, it doesn't have to be 8. People come together in a small group to do intention, and they keep meeting over and over. Pretty much 100% of them experience major transformation. Now, I used to ask myself, what are the odds against chance of this happening? But I don't ask myself that anymore, because when I look at the intention experiments and I see consistently there have been our violence experiments have demonstrated, I think we've done 8 peace intention experiments now, 8 or 9, and we've shown in pretty much every instance when we've actually measured the scientific data and looked at a lowering of violence, we found violence has gone down. It happened in Sri Lanka during the the civil war that was going on there. We did that in 2008. 2012 in Washington, D.C. 2000 in St. Louis, Missouri, officially the most violent place in America. The one little neighborhood, it went down. So, I asked myself, well, did we do this? Do we do any of this? And, short answer, who cares? What I can tell you is what I see. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people coming together in a group, an intention experiment or a Power of 8 group, and healing their own life and healing their families. And with that momentum of peace and healing, that can radiate out into the world and make major, major changes. So I continue to do this. I continue to measure, and I can explain a lot of it to you. I can tell you that it is something to do with altruism. It's something to do with oneness, the group effect, and probably entrainment. But there's also an X factor here that I really can't explain, that I have to take on faith. Now, I stumbled into all of this work simply by asking a question, being a skeptical journalist. And the Power of 8 groups came about completely by accident, simply wanting to see what would happen if we brought together, people, a small group of people, rather than thousands around the world for an intention experiment. What if we just put a group of 8 together and have them send healing intention to a member of the group with a health challenge? So this started out with curiosity, but I also realized that life gave me this to be a kind of gatekeeper, to tell the world about this, to help people heal themselves and understand the amazing power that each of us holds, more amazing than the most incredible technique, power to heal each other, to heal ourselves, to heal the world. We have the power to heal everything in our lives. So I feel like I'm a gatekeeper, but somebody wrote to me this. They said, you are doing more than research. You are breaking open people's hearts. And I hope that is what you experience. If you try a Power of 8 group, don't simply take it from me. I am the gatekeeper, but this extraordinary power we hold belongs to each of us. It's a bit like being Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz and just clinking your heels together to realize you have the power to go home. So try this for yourself and find out how to heal your life and the world. Now, before I leave you, I just want to tell you a bit about some of the work I do. So the original research is in my book, The Power of 8, my latest book, and it also describes how to set up a Power of 8 group. And the field, I started my work, I published that book 20 years ago, and that was all about the fact that we are all part of a giant quantum energy field. So that laid the groundwork for the new science. The intention experiment provided not only all of the science about intention, but an invitation to take part in these massive intention experiments. The Bond was my book that answers Darwin, who essentially created a leitmotif of competitive individualism. And that book is really an answer to that, saying we were never meant to be competitive or even individual. We were always meant to be part of a larger whole. So please check out my books. And I have a podcast now. You can just connect onto my website, lynnmctaggart.com. Check out my podcast under all my broadcasts. I have weekly blogs that I do. And I also run a magazine that's an international magazine in many languages now, 15 languages, called What Doctors Don't Tell You. You can find out about that at wddty.com. And I run many courses, not only a year-long masterclass, my one major class, but also smaller classes on intention. So we do Intention Essentials. We do an advanced class, Intention In and Out of Time. So check out all of my courses. I have many about the new science, not only as podcasts, but also as courses. So check out everything on lynnmctaggart.com. And I run retreats basically once a year with my husband, Brian Hubbard, who is the amazing author of a book of You, which is essentially he's created a therapy called Time Light, which helps people overcome the things in their past that are impeding their present. And the theory of his work is that the past inhabits us and creates us like an unwanted guest. And he helps you free yourself of that. So we run these retreats together. And the latest one we're going to be doing, which is over New Year's, December 28th to January 4th, is called Into the Light, using intention to supercharge 2022, because we know we all need a boost. And our work is very much about healing the past, using intention and the Time Light system to heal the past and also create your amazing and transformational future. So check out all of the stuff, and that's with Global J organization that will be sponsoring our retreats. So please check that out. Check out my website, check out my work, and there's anybody who signs up on my website, lynnmctaggart.com, gets instructions about how to set up your own Power 8 group, including a video from me. So check out everything about me. And as I say, you have the power inside yourself. People have denied it. Maybe your parents did, maybe your teachers did, but you have that power. So unleash it yourself and understand with a group how to heal your life. Thank you so much for listening.